Thanks for coming along. My name's Katrina Clokie. This is a presentation that I searched for on the internet about 2 years ago, and it didn't exist. And so I wanted to come and deliver this talk primarily for other people who will end up in this position of being appointed to a C-level role, being asked to do their first deep dive with the board, and feeling like, oh my God, what am I supposed to say? What is this going to be like? How will it work? Until I was in a CTO role, my exposure to the board was fairly limited. I used to get pulled in usually in negative situations when there'd been an incident in my area of the department or we had a delivery delay. And my role there was just to support the CTO. If there were questions that they couldn't answer, it'd get passed down. What I want to talk about is how to understand the board, how to prepare a presentation for the board, and how to interact with the board during board meetings. So, quick show of hands, how many of you could name the people on your company board? Oh, that's more than I thought, maybe half. So my exposure to the board pre-C-level, as I said, was pretty minimal. And a lot of the anxiety I had about my first board meeting was that I didn't know who I was going to be talking to. When you're preparing presentation and delivering a presentation, a key part of that is knowing your audience and understanding where they're at and what they want to hear about. I was really fortunate, in retrospect, to have 5 months last year where the company I was in had no CEO and no head of product. And so during that time, I was working really closely with our board. And I think that period in particular gave me a level of exposure to the board and experience that now kind of informs the rest of this talk. So first you want to learn a little bit about your board. Boards have formal roles. There'll be a board chair who's going to be the person technically in charge. They're setting the agenda, they're running the meeting, and they're the main liaison between your board and your company. There'll be a secretary. In New Zealand, it's common for this to be an executive. So our chief legal or our CFO is often the board secretary. I'm not sure if that's true in Europe as well. Then you'll have directors who are people who are going to advise the business on strategy or risk, performance, and their voting. And board observers are people who are there to learn. Board observers are people who don't really have any power or sway, and so they can be quite fun, especially when they're asking you questions that are really curly. Navigating that dynamic on the board can be a bit of a challenge. The board roles on paper are pretty easy to discover, but then the people on the board are also going to bring kind of a persona or role into the board as well. So among your directors or maybe your board chair, you might have a founder, especially if you're in a smaller business like an early stage SaaS startup or scale up. Founders are going to have a deeply personal connection to the company. They want to avoid mission drift. They are really invested in the power dynamics of the business because they want it to stay true to how they originally started the company. They're going to be talking to you about culture and staff, primarily to try and retain the culture and staff that they started the business with. And they want an exit strategy because a lot of founders get to a point where they would like some return from the business. But they want an exit that's going to align with their personal goals and their financial goals and the mission of the company overall. You'll have people on the board who are either investors themselves or representing investors. If you've had VC or private equity funding or some kind of institutional investment, these people usually have a pretty impersonal relationship with the business. Like, compared to a founder, someone who's on your board from a VC probably doesn't care as much about your specific business. What they want is the commercial outcome. And some of the people who have this role will be serving on multiple boards within the same industry as a VC or private equity kind of employee. So I was in a construction SaaS business. We had VC people on our board who were on the board for other construction SaaS companies and also for other SaaS scale-up businesses. And so they bring in kind of a basis for comparison. They can tell you how you're going against other people in your industry and field. Then you have advisors. So these are the people who are often in director roles, and they bring like a specific area of domain knowledge that's going to be valuable to governing your company. So this might be like someone who works in insurance and has a really good understanding of risk and governance, or someone who works in revenue ops and can advise you on your global go-to-market strategy. So these people, they want visibility of the thing they know the most about, so that then they can influence what your company is going to do in that area. They're also really good at connecting you to people from their domain. So if you are talking about, say, your go-to-market strategy for the US, and you've got a person on your board who is well connected in the revenue ops field, they'll be able to broker introductions to other people that you want to connect with and get value from. So we talked about roles on the board and personas on the board. There's also a level of commitment, because board members will have differing levels of equity in the company. So I think of this like the fable of the chicken and the pig, which I think is common knowledge, but the fable runs in the Wikipedia version. A pig and a chicken are walking down the road. The chicken says, "Hey pig, I was thinking we should open a restaurant." Pig replies, "Maybe, what would we call it?" The chicken responds, "How about ham and eggs?" The pig thinks for a moment and says, "No thanks, I'd be committed, but you'd only be involved." So the people on your board, like your directors, your advisors, your people from VCs, they're all going to have similar wants and needs from the company, but how hard they're going to fight in a board meeting is a bit about how much skin in the game they have. So chickens tend to back off pretty fast. The people who've committed ham are going to go to the mattresses about stuff. So understanding who has equity and how much and what type, who's got like preferred shares, who has proportions higher than others, that dynamic can play out in a board meeting in a way that's like it's useful to understand why that's going on. So if you are in a position where you're asked to go and present to the board, I would recommend that you spend a little bit of time mapping out who you're actually going to be meeting and speaking with. Ideally, you'd try and find their photos, because I find it's hard to just know people without seeing like a face and a name. You want to research who the chair is, who's the secretary, who are directors, who's investors, who the founder is if they're there, and then if you can, find out like what equity stake they have. Just a note on that, it's kind of interesting. Sometimes the investor persona is a chicken, because if you're a VC employee, you don't always get equity in the companies that you're on the board for. Like the VC fund has the equity, but you're the employee of that company. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anyway, so do your research. When you do this, you're also going to realize that the board have the same challenge as you, kind of in reverse. So when you're in the exec, your visibility of the board is sort of funneled through this pipeline where you talk to the CEO. The CEO is usually talking to mostly the chair of the board, and then the chair is the one wrangling the board members. And when you're giving the presentation to the board, you're kind of bypassing that normal funnel and going round. But I also found it really useful to realize that to the board, you're one of 6 or more executives in one of the companies that they're on the board for. And sometimes your part of the business is kind of fine, and they don't want to engage with you as much as they want to interrogate someone else. And so I remember in one of my early board meetings, I went in, I'd given my pre-read and my presentation. I was all steeled to be interrogated, and I think I got 2 questions. It lasted about 2.5 minutes, and then they said, "Great, thanks, Katrina." And I thought, oh my God, is that bad? And then my boss was like, no, like you gave them the information, they know it's under control, basically tick, you've passed, see you later. And so the other thing I would mention to people feeling anxious about this is you're probably not as important as you think, and this might not be as painful as you imagine. Last point on knowing the board is understanding the logistics of how your board operates. So I think it's usual for a board to meet monthly and for there to be a pre-read. For us, our pre-read was due 5 days prior, so that the board have time to look through that pack. For us, we used to use company-branded PowerPoint for our reporting. You might have a different schema for doing that. So understanding the cadence of meetings, how the reporting comes in when it's due, is also a really important thing to discover. Okay, so when you know who you're talking to and when and what you have to do, what do you actually then do? So you will see from the URL that this was approximately 2 years ago. This article was very helpful to me in the absence of a presentation such as this. And the author is making 2 key points here. The first one is that your goal in a board meeting is not just to report the results, but implicit in that is you do have to first report the results. So that's what I'm going to talk about first, is how do you tell the board what's been going on. The board don't really care what you're doing. What they care about is why it matters, and you need to help them understand the impact of your team, not the activity. So a specific example, I wouldn't talk to the board about us implementing a firewall rule. What I'd be talking to the board about is mitigating the risk of our customer accounts with weak credentials being accessed by malicious actors. They don't care how we did that. What they care about is the impact of that change. When you're doing your reporting to the board, you're usually trying to cover off a few key things. You're going to talk about the impact of recent delivery. So like what your team has done in a meaningful way to change the business and how it operates. The board always want to know about the productivity of engineering. They don't care who, but they care how many and that they're getting value for money from those people. I personally found DORA metrics really useful because most of the board members had a high level of familiarity with those, and it gave us some common language for talking about productivity of our teams. In the early days, I could get away with just talking about adoption of AI, but now you have to talk about the impact of your adoption of AI. It's not enough to just say you're doing it, you have to say why it matters. I talked to the board about stability and specifically about the Sev1 production incidents. Again, not about what happened specifically, but why that was a problem. And then security posture, broadly, I would only be updating them when our security posture shifted. So if we had pen testing results and we had new risk, or if we'd invested time and mitigated risk, making sure that they had an updated understanding of what our posture looked like. Broadly speaking, my risk posture, I would have preferred us to be more conservative in our risk appetite, and I worked with a board who were pretty comfortable with us flying to the sun on some things, and so this was kind of an active conversation that we would have back and forward. So this is one of several little animated GIFs that are available from Dark Course Analytics. If you haven't come across their work before, I'd really recommend that you look it up. It's a great way of showing the difference between something being simple and being short. You can have 2 slides, but if they're jammed with information and it's hard to understand them, like, it's still not an effective presentation. So, general advice for your reporting: keep it simple, keep it short. Don't blindside your CEO, which might sound obvious, but you're effectively presenting to their boss when you talk to the board. And so you want to make sure that your CEO is on the same page about everything that's going into your report, because the first person who's going to get a call if the board are surprised or upset about something that you're saying is the CEO, and you want them to be able to answer the same way that you would answer. Because once you're in the board meeting, you should be showing that you're aligned. The other thing around reporting is that you don't want to duplicate between execs. So as an example, the board were also interested in engagement scores, but my head of people and culture used to report that, and there was no use in me having it in my report for engineering because I knew she was covering it for the company. The head of product used to include impact of feature delivery outcomes. So the impact I would talk about was somewhat constrained to kind of platform or security-based change that we were making. So talk to your team, because if you don't, you look dumb. The board are getting the same thing twice, and they know that the exec aren't functioning well when they see that. Like, that's an anti-pattern of the reporting. Okay, then we're back at this quote. The most important part of the board meeting is actually talking about stuff that's coming up, because the things you've reported on have already happened, and the board can't do anything about that. Like, they want to know what's happened, but the main reason they're there is to influence decisions and direction about what's coming next. So, what do they want to talk about? the conversations they want to have are broadly in these categories. They're not going to want to talk about engineering, but they are going to want to talk about the engineering stuff that falls within these buckets, right? So if your company's assessing like a merger or acquisition and you're doing due diligence, and there's some kind of technical risk that you've discovered in that activity, you want to have that conversation. If your security posture has changed, if you've just been DDoSed or something, if you've made a decision strategically and you want the board to give you advice on what they're seeing elsewhere or what questions they would have for you about that, and health of the team, if you're seeing like high churn in your staff or you want headcount for something, all this will come through in the discussion. So always put the forward-thinking slide first. Talk about what's coming and explain why, and then invite conversation. Most of the time, in the actual meeting, you won't move on to any of your other slides. My CEO used to put all the rest of my report in the appendix, and we would get like one slide each about what's coming, which really used to annoy me. I was like, I spent a lot of time on this report, and he's like, yeah, but they read it, it's happened, they know what's going on, that's all the context that they need for the conversation about what we're doing next. The thing we'll do in the meeting is talk about what's coming. All right. I want to talk about how you have the conversation. So you've presented your beautiful report, you've talked about what's coming next, and then you're going to say, what questions or advice do you have for me? You want to ask an open question that is genuinely inviting conversation and input from the board. Then they're going to start asking you stuff. And when they do that, you should just answer the question. One of the things that I saw my peers getting in trouble for is that they would try and give context, and then they'd anticipate what they thought the next question was going to be, and they got a reputation for being waffly in their response. You have to assume that the board are smart, that they've read the pre-read, that they have comparable experience, that they're going to be mapping to the situation that you're talking about, and that if they're asking you a question, you can just answer their question and then move on. Don't get a reputation for being the person who, holds things up. Don't try to make stuff up. The not saying I don't know thing might be controversial. I find, particularly as a woman in these forums, that I lose credibility whenever I just say I don't know. Like, I'm a proponent for I don't know in other places, but if I'm in a board meeting, I'm not going to use verbatim I don't know. I'll use a phrase like, I don't have that answer today. Let me come back to you. This is when I'm going to come back to you. And then the last thing on this is, when you're the person presenting and directing that discussion, often you'll hit a nerve with the board member who knows the most about that specific area that you're discussing, and they'll keep going. And technically, the board chair should be the person to do this, but often you're the one in the conversation, and it's easier for you to say, actually, thanks, blah. Like, I've noted what you said. Like, you want them to know that you heard them and you can reflect it back. But now we're going to move on. I'd like to hear the opinions from other people or what other questions are out there. I don't think you should be afraid to do this. It's not rude. It shows the board that you've got strong leadership and facilitation skills, and it's also going to maximize what you take from the board meeting because you're hearing more perspectives from around the table. Okay, the last thought I have on this is a little note about why this is hard, which I didn't really know where to fit into this talk, so here it is. When you first start your career, you're in a delivery team and you make that jump from delivery team to tech leadership team, and people talk about that shift from IC to manager and that being a change, right? In both those contexts, your peers are all people who work in technology. In the delivery team, you're working with other individual contributors on a piece of software. In the technology leadership team, you're working with other departments, but broadly speaking, you're all working on either software or hardware or, applications, something about tech. When you go into the exec leadership team, it's the first time that your first team is not a tech team. Your peers become sales, customer success, country managers, the CEO, the CFO, your legal counsel, a broad variety of people, right? And the concept of first team, it comes from Patrick Lencioni. He says team members must prioritize the team they're a member of over the team that they lead or manage. So basically this is saying the exec team becomes your home team. That's the place where you have to operate. And what I found about the board is that they're sort of judging how successfully you make this transition, because none of what you're saying in the board meeting is specifically centered on engineering or tech. It's centered on the business. You're talking about impact for the business and commercial and risk and strategy and culture and health. And engineering is the context that you're bringing to those discussions, but the discussions are business discussions because your first team is now the cross-functional leadership team of the entire organization. And I feel like that shift was one I didn't fully understand or appreciate until I was doing it. Not having technical peers is quite weird when it's the first time you've been in that situation. You realize the people around you lack a whole lot of context, but also that they don't really need it to have the conversations that need to steer the business forward. So if you're feeling whoa, I'm anxious about this is all a weird environment, what's going on? I think this is why, and it's okay. All right, key takeaways. If you get asked to go and present to the board, first spend some time understanding who the board are. Map out who they are, their names, their photos, what roles they hold, what personas they have, how committed they are to the company through equity. That map is going to help you navigate the discussions you'll have in a board meeting. Prepare a board report, make it short and simple, focused on impact. And then when you're in the meeting itself, invite and lead the strategic discussion about what's coming next, because the meeting is future focused. The report is the stuff that's happened, taken as read, context. The meeting is where we're going to make decisions and move forward on stuff together. And lastly, know that you know the most about what you're talking about in the board meeting, but that you need to be open to the advice and questions and input of the board. This is a really interesting dance because you have to be confident, but you also have to be humble and prepared to adjust your course based on what those advisors are going to tell you about the trajectory that you're mapping. And I think these are the things I wish I knew 2 years ago to have a successful and strong relationship between CTO and board. So thank you for listening. I have 10 minutes. I always feel like question time is awkward, so I'm going to say I'll just stay here for 10 minutes and you can come chat with me if you would like to. And I'm also going to be at the speakers library from 11 till the next session, and I'm very happy to speak with you. Cool. Thanks for coming.